President Trump has long been critical of NATO allies for what he calls their free riding on the US defense umbrella. He's even pressured allies to step up their defense spending in return for the US maintaining its current force posture on the continent. A new defense priorities explainer argues that this is a bad deal for the United States and that Washington should stop bargaining with Europe and begin a phased withdrawal from the continent. I'm Adam Gallagher, a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, and today I'll be speaking with Policy Director Ben Friedman, one of the co authors of that paper, who's going to explain why it's time that the United States started leaving Europe. Here are three things you need to know. Hey, Ben, thanks for joining me today to talk about your new explainer about the U.S. troop presence in Europe and why it's time for the U.S. to start pulling back.
Thanks for having me here.
So there's been a lot of back and forth between the U.S. and Europe lately. President Trump has said he's going to reduce the U.S. troop presence in Germany. There's been a back and forth about U.S. troops in Poland. And going back to the first Trump administration, there's been a lot of harsh rhetoric about free riding and ripping off the U.S. But essentially, that U.S. troop presence has remained unchanged under Trump. So can you just unpack for us basically what's going on here between Washington and Europe right now?
Yeah, well, the big recent announcement was, as you said, that we're going to pull 5,000 troops out of Germany. It's basically a brigade combat team, we call them now. The president did that in response to the German chancellor saying that the United States had been humiliated in its Iran war. It was a punitive act.
Right.
And around the same time, we announced that we were canceling the rotational deployment of this multi-domain task force. It's really just a unit that fires a lot of kinds of long-range missiles and mid-range missiles. It's sort of a bunch of firepower that the Biden administration had agreed to send to Germany. Trump canceled that deployment. Then it was announced that we were canceling the deployment of some troops that were going to rotate into Poland. And that was quickly reversed 2 weeks later by President Trump saying that because Poland had elected someone that he likes, new president who he's comfortable with, that we weren't going to do that anymore. And then there's been also some talk about reducing the number of U.S. troops and bombers and so forth that are available on short notice if there's a war in Europe, basically like a rapid reaction force. So that doesn't have anything to do with like actual forces that are in Europe or likely to be going there, but it's a sort of a planning decision that might be politically important. So altogether, I think that people seeing these headlines, even though the Poland part of it was reversed, get the sense that, the United States is really stepping away from Europe, even though they're spending more on defense. And that, this is consistent with this idea that Trump is, either an isolationist or someone who wants to just dump the burden of defending Europe onto Europe and leave them to deal with Russia on their own. And my view is basically, if only it were so.
Yeah.
Going back to the first Trump administration, I think Trump's behavior and that of his administrations have been characterized by what Barry Posen called illiberal hegemony, which is the idea that you're not getting rid of U.S. military dominance and most of the bases and garrisons and forces that enforce it. You're just getting higher rents for it. You're trying to extract more for it. And I think in this case, what we're seeing is Trump, what we've seen over the last year and change is Trump trying to get more for our forces in Europe. And he has, in a sense, there was this pledge at The Hague by all NATO countries last year to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense and then another 1.5 on related infrastructure. And Trump really heralded that victory. He said it was a wonderful outcome for the United States. And I think that shows a lot. It shows that he's more interested in this sort of outcome, which really should be a means to an end, which is to get them to spend more. Most people who want that want to do it so that we can do less, reduce our own costs and burdens. And Trump doesn't really seem to want to do that part. The thing in Germany, the reduction in forces there, it's just substantial. It's 5,000 out of 30,000 or so, or 35,000 in Germany. there's around 80,000 U.S. troops in Europe overall, but it's clearly punitive about Iran and not part of some larger plan. And what we don't see is some kind of larger plan to reduce U.S. forces in Europe. We have this sort of, we're going to threaten to withdraw forces so that you guys toe the line on our political priorities like war in Iran, and so that you pledge to spend more, but it's not really withdrawal, which is what my co-author Moritz Greyfarth and I advocate in this paper.
Yeah, right. And I want to dig in exactly to that aspect of your paper a little bit more now. You traditionally the idea is that Europe spends more on its defense to shoulder more of the burden for its own defense, and that the US can then, withdraw, confident that Europe is capable of protecting itself and, theoretically standing up to Russia. But the Trump administration hasn't coupled these increases in defense spending pledges with, commitments to withdraw. And you argue that that's a bad deal for the United States. So why is focusing on Europe spending the wrong approach? And then why is that a bad deal for the US, like you argue in your paper?
Yeah, I think there's three quick reasons for that, three quick answers. One is the spending pledges are just that, pledges, and they might not be realized. Certainly, I think there's a general move in parts of Europe and Germany and certainly in Eastern Europe to spend more in defense. I think that's basically a response to the war in Ukraine, and it's ongoing. But the longer term, I think the countries in Europe might not or are unlikely to realize their pledged spending levels for the most part, including the big states like Germany, because the pressure from the United States will be gone. I mean, Trump tends to sort of lose focus on things and move on. In this case, he's already kind of declared victory, arguably, but he also won't be president that much longer. We'll see, who the next president is, but their pledges might not outlast his presidency. And so they're not supposed to realize them, I think, until the middle of the next decade, where they get to that, 3.5% or 5% if you include the infrastructure. So the spending might not be real. That's one. Two, even if it is, it's I think 30 countries, plus the U.S. and Canada in NATO. So the European countries are 30, and it's all the spending is split up into all these different agendas. It's not very well unified. It's not clear that it's going to actually, produce that much useful outputs. What the Europeans really need, people can debate this, but what they could use if they're going to rely less on the United States is really the ability to get a lot of manpower quickly into Eastern Europe, to Poland, and then potentially to the Baltic states, where a war is most likely. And it seems very unlikely that this spending will be concentrated, on those most useful things. So it's of course it's going to produce more military capability, which would be useful, in a war with Russia if they, get even close to their pledges, but it's far from the most efficient way to do it. And it's not the same thing as getting rid of dependence on the United States or, developing a strategically autonomous kind of European military capability. And then third and most importantly, we argue that the United States just doesn't have to care that much about how much Europeans spend on security. We don't need to make our force presence in Europe beholden to their doing more, so that we do less as they do more, because the Russian threat just isn't as great as people think it is. So to me, it's kind of like we have far more military capability between the United States and Europe than is needed to deter Russia from attacking a NATO country, and certainly attacking into the heart of Europe and threatening the United States. And if we reduce our role in that, it would, there'll still be a pretty stable balance of power that does more than enough to deter Russia, especially with the prospect of nuclear war. And then also we see in Ukraine, I think that, not only is Russia failing to succeed there, but we see advantages for defense and warfare that are a result of changing military technology that I think are very good news for defenders of the territorial status quo, as we are, as NATO is. So that means I think that you need even less spending and forces in Europe to kind of maintain stability and deterrence.
Right. So in the end, in your paper, you argue that the U.S. should stop this bargaining and back and forth with Europe and just start leaving. So I'm wondering if you can make that case here. And then you already started touching on it a bit related to Russia, but how would you could dig a little bit deeper into this common objection that, if the U.S. pulls away from the continent, it offers Russia, some sort of opportunity to continue territorial advances, which Europeans may argue that Putin or Moscow are interested in.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the title of our piece is, stop bargaining, start leaving. And by leaving, what we mean is, look, ideally, you would just lay out a kind of plan. And, Defense Priorities is published work that goes into some detail on this sort of thing. A plan of withdrawing forces, not going anywhere near zero, but of moving away from having so many deployed conventional forces in Europe and shifting to a setup where we have far fewer ground forces and more, potential for long-range strike, including with nuclear weapons. I think, transitioning to a situation where it's European nukes that are doing the deterring rather than American ones is a good idea, even longer term than that. So the more the plan is, sort of intentional and laid out and clear, the easier it is for Europeans to make, the adjustments that they may make or they may not, depending on how threatened they feel, to sort of fill in the gap. So that's the ideal way to do it. Do I think we're actually going to do the ideal thing, this administration at least? No, certainly not. I think, it's almost certainly going to be more chaotic. And I think, that's okay as long as it moves in that direction. I think the big thing that I emphasize is, don't reassure them. There's this idea that you always want to reassure allies that everything will be okay.
Right.
I think we don't want to do that, not because things won't be okay. I think they will, but because, we don't want to reassure them that, if they don't do enough, that we'll fix everything for them. That's their lack of being reassured by us is what's the impetus, which might not be enough for them to develop more of their own capabilities and actually take on more of the burden of their own defenses. So that, the main thing is to sort of have this political shift where they're less reliant on us, as opposed to, the exact details of how we're going to start the withdrawal and how far it will go. Getting to the question of Russia, the general perception, I think, that animates the idea that, we can't do anything to reduce our forces unless Europeans are doing more is a view of the balance of power in Europe, which is extremely brittle. And brittle in the sense that the Russians are sort of like a panting dog that's about to bite and attack, if only they can sort of see a way through the fence, which is our collective capabilities that deters them. And I think that's just not even close to true. I mean, I think the Russian intentions, which are harder to get into details about or harder to prove, suggest that they had an obvious fixation on Ukraine, on arguably on Georgia, but the evidence that they're interested in attacking a NATO state is pretty close to zero. The risks, I think, are just too great, and their desires aren't there. But then their capabilities, just, I think, if you look into detail about how much trouble they're having in Ukraine, just sort of extending their lines, a few hundred miles past their own border, you see that they're going to have massive trouble, even if they have time to rebuild. Extending them into Poland, and I think there's the example of Ukraine, which is a much weaker state than most Western European countries, especially if they work together, shows if they're moving forward en masse, drones allow you to, and other surveillance capabilities, but drones especially now allow you to see them and put precise fires on them. So defense has growing advantages.
Yeah.
And, that's just another reason why I think, that the Russians aren't about to sort of reclaim their Soviet empire. And the Europeans, I think actually kind of act like they understand that. So of course, there's a lot of Europeans, people in the Baltics are very different than Western Europeans. But as much as they say, they're terrified of the Russian threat and the United States needs to stay, I don't see them actually making moves that show that they're so terrified. I think they sort of have a more relaxed view of the threat, which is consistent with the reality that I described. That the Russians might be doing terrible things in Ukraine, and be more aggressive than most states. But there's just, we're not at this moment in time where they're, 5 years from now, if they rebuild, they're just going to attack NATO.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, the combined US European resources, but just European resources alone, whether it's GDP, military spending, they dwarf Russia's. They clearly have power advantage there.
Yeah, GDP, military spending, manpower, militaries. Of course, the argument is always, well, that capability is broken up into all these pieces. They have collective
Right. There's
action.
political problems. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But what solves those political problems, at least partially, is a menacing threat. And you don't get there
Right.
if the United States is, standing in the way. I don't think the threat is that menacing in any event, but they, if the United States is doing less to protect Europeans, they have this capability if they need it to step up and meet the Russian threat and sort of unify their capabilities and have a more European defense. That's possible. You can't do it instantly, but I don't think the threat's going to manifest instantly either. So, it's I think pretty safe for us to do a lot less for them. And by the way, and to wish them kind of good luck and, not to do this in a hateful, angry way.
Sure.
It's sort of
Yeah.
see sometimes from the Trump administration where we're, mad at them for not doing their fair share. I don't think, my co-author in this is German. We're not that mad at the Europeans. We're not mad at them really at all. We just,
Right.
it's about U.S. interests and reducing our own costs and risks.
Right. Right. Well, great. Thanks a lot for that analysis, Ben. And I want to encourage everybody to visit defensepriorities.org and check out your paper and some of the other work we've done on U.S. force posture in Europe and around the world.
All right. Thanks, Adam.